Hey guys, Alex here, and today we're going to be covering the Winawer variation of the French defense, which is one of the most, if not the most complex and dynamic variation in the French. It starts after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and following white's third move, knight to c3, black plays bishop to b4. This is a developing move, but it's also a very committal move, and it's very ambitious, high stakes sort of move. The point is that sooner or later, black will, more often than not, will capture here on c3, and that will cause a structural damage for white. On the other hand, white will usually immediately proceed to grab some space in the center, and he will combine his space in the center with the fact that black will not have this bishop to launch a kingside attack, typically focusing on this point of g7. The reason why g7 is an important point to focus on is because so many of the black pawns are on light squares. That means structurally black is a little bit weak on the dark squares, and on top of that, black is parting ways with his dark square bishop, so he's especially vulnerable to an attack along those squares. The logic behind black's play, on the other hand, is speedy development and, more than anything, causing serious damage to the white queenside pawn structure. You could say that, structurally speaking, white is pretty much lost on the queenside. And if black can have his way on that side of the board, then he can win, especially if he can take the game to endgame waters, then white can really be in a lot of trouble. Very complex lines, and we'll take a look at them. But before we dive into this main line, which is e5, I will show two other possibilities here. The first is to capture on d5, which would take us into a game more like a French exchange. And the second option is knight e2, which is the so-called Alekhine Gambit. Let's first take a look at e takes d5 here. For me, this move, although it's been essayed by players of the caliber of Vachier-Lagrave, Anand and Carlsen, it doesn't, in my opinion, cause black so many headaches, but it's a great choice if you as a white player want something a little bit calmer against the Winawer. Black here should recapture with the pawn, of course, just creating symmetry, and of course the bishop now is active. White follows up with bishop to d3, and black plays the move knight to c6, pressing the pawn on d4. At this point, the main line continues with a3, challenging this bishop, and black most of the time has actually captured. But in my opinion, one way for black to play here that doesn't really give him any serious problems is the way that Mehmet Yarov approached a game of his in 2018 against Hao Yifan. He played bishop a5, and Hao Yifan continued with knight e2, and then black played knight to e7, and after castle, white tried to provoke some weaknesses in the black position with the move bishop g5. Black agreed and played f6. As you can see, there are some structural weaknesses as a result. But when white dropped the bishop, as you can see from this illustration here, the most powerful piece is this light squared bishop here on d3. And so black just played bishop f5, challenging that bishop and forcing the exchange. And after knight f4, first he captured on c3. This was kind of a nice idea because once knight f4 was played, white threatens to move the knight, and you run the risk at times that this bishop is going to be left behind, left a little bit locked out of the game after white at some point plays the move pawn to c3. So he captured here on c3, takes, and then played queen d7. Mehmet Yarov went on to win this game, but the result is not what's relevant. What's relevant is that here, although white is not worse, white has this superior center, I also don't feel like white is better. It's hard to see serious problems for black here. The weakness is not very significant, and black's development is quite straightforward. Notice especially this light squared bishop, which gives black a lot of problems in many lines. In this case, it's just a great piece, and it's going to be exchanged for white's best minor piece very soon. So this, for me, is not it's not really the way to press your opponents, but you can do so if you want a quieter, more maneuvering positional game. Very interesting is the move knight e2. I've played it myself in tournaments before when I was much younger. I was a 1e4 player. But I think that modern theory suggests this move is not so convincing. After pawn takes e4 here, white follows up with a3. And basically white's idea is that he would love black to capture, and then play some silly move. And then white could take and have this very nice center and not have had his pawns doubled and have won this bishop from black. So he wants to have his cake and eat it. But of course, black, it's black's move, and he can do something a lot better than play h6 here. And the really annoying move is knight to c6. Now white has tried several different ideas here, but none of them fully convince. Perhaps the absolute most interesting move is d5 here, and after e takes d5 play queen takes d5, and after bishop to e6 play queen takes e4, and after knight to f6 drive the queen to h4. Something like this. However, black can continue with moves like queen d4 or bishop f5, and you can see that development advantage is not so great for white, and material is completely equal. It's true that white has the bishop pair, but black's knights are very strong here. So I think that although you could argue that white is fractionally better, it's really slim pickings here. I think it's approximate equality, and the tournament results suggest that. That may be the best approach, nevertheless, because the main line by popularity, bishop to b5 here, I should note white cannot capture this pawn immediately because this pawn on d4 is under fire. The main line, bishop b5, I think, if anything, I kind of prefer black after it. Black would go knight to e7 here. Again, you could take the pawn now because this guy is no longer under fire, but after castle c3, black has moves like queen d5 and e5, which I promise you are giving black at least equality. So therefore white goes bishop to g5. Black now responds with f6, and now white defends the pawn with bishop e3. The argument from white is that this move, provoking this move, is a bit of a strategic success, a strategic victory, and so now he just allows black to castle, and he plays queen d2, and his intention is to castle queenside and for now play down a pawn. Indeed, black could play some other move, like let's say he could play a move like a6 here, and I think that black would objectively be fine in a position like this, let's say. White has been allowed to recover his pawn, but black can easily complete his development, maybe something like b6, bishop b7, put a queen on d5, break with e5 at some point. The position seems fine. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint what could give white an advantage here, on what grounds he might claim an advantage. So on top of this, of course, I think that the main move f5 here is probably just best, defending the pawn on e4, and white's idea is to play with queenside castle and to play down a pawn and sort of try to argue that he has compensation because he has easier development. Black's bishop is still stuck, and he can break with f3, and maybe after this exchange he can attack along the g file. And there's some truth to this. He does have significant compensation, but in my opinion he doesn't have full compensation. So if you're of course looking at it from the black side, then I think you should be quite happy to see this so-called Alekhine Gambit. So therefore we're on to the big test, which is the move pawn to e5, and here black continues with c5, very typical in French. We're going to see this time and time again, and now white almost always continues with a3. You could try something quiet like bishop to d2 if you decide you really don't want that structural damage after bishop takes knight, but the price that you're going to pay for a move like this is that you're not going to really press the opponent. For example, one line that I think is a good way to solve black's tiny opening problems, if there even are any, is like this: knight e7, a3. Now the exchange happens. White has prevented the damage of his structure, but it's come at the cost of time, you know, with these moves here. And the bishop also on c3 is not so strong. So knight to c6, knight to f3, and here just capturing on d4. If you play bishop takes d4 here, then black will at some point put his knight on f5, putting a bunch of pressure here on this bishop. White usually continues with c3, but you know, after a move like castle or after a move like bishop d7, it's hard to see how white can have an advantage here, because he has a little bit more space, but black will have gotten rid of already one set of minor pieces and potentially a second set, capturing at the right moment. So very, very hard to see any objective advantage here for white. So white usually instead captures with the knight, but this allows black, among other things, to just capture here on e5. And after knight takes e6, otherwise you're down a pawn. Knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e5, castle. This is the kind of position that a lot of less experienced players will look at and will say, oh, this is really, really good for white because I have the bishop pair and my opponent has a bad structure. But in fact, black's coordination is very good here. So the game is probably something close to equal. He also has a little bit of a slight lead in development. So for example, the game might continue bishop d3, knight c6, bishop g3, and now queen f6, striking at this pawn. White should defend the pawn, of course, and now move like bishop f5. Quickly, black uses his superior development and coordination to challenge white's bishop pair. And at the end of it, it's true that black is still left with this isolated queen's pawn, but there are worse things in life than an isolated queen's pawn. So it's objectively this is equal. And actually in tournament practice, black has even won this a little bit more frequently than white has. Maybe the possibility is that this knight is slightly stronger than the bishop and that this pawn can be more of an asset than a liability, but I'm not sure. I haven't looked at those games in depth. So this was that whole line arose from this move bishop d2. So now onto the serious move, which is a3. Now black doesn't actually have to take, although that is what he does most of the time. He can go bishop to a5, and here this is the so-called Armenian variation or the retreat variation. White should know one key idea here, which is this move pawn to b4. Black really shouldn't be capturing this pawn, because after knight to b5, it's true that in some lines black can win a pawn or two, but the problem is that there's a huge hole here on d6, which the white knight is about to jump into. Any move other than bishop c7 is going to lead to knight d6 check, and then black is going to lose his right to castle. And bishop c7 doesn't actually solve matters. Here white can continue with moves like bishop takes a3, for now leaving the king cut off in the middle of the board, and also a move like queen g4, which is really a very, very uncomfortable move to face because of the pressure here against g7. And because white will recover this pawn, it means that he'll only be down one pawn overall, and in exchange for that pawn he'll have had smooth development, a great center, the bishop pair typically after capturing here, more space, and a serious attack. So you do the maths, this is a lot to give up for just a pawn. So after bishop a5, b4, black actually captures this pawn here on d4. And white has some crazy ideas like queen g4, but the main line is knight to b5, again with these ideas of knight d6 check. Black prevents them with bishop c7, and white usually just defends the pawn on e5. Black challenges this knight with bishop to d7, and typically white, okay, can do a lot of things. He can capture on c7, he can take on d4, he can even just continue his development, since this is not the end of the world. The main line does run knight takes c7, queen takes c7, and here just development with knight f3. And one resource to keep in mind if you're playing this from black side is this move bishop to a4. I think we mentioned it at the very start of the video. Putting pressure on c2 is quite nice here. White should not take on d4 as a means to defend, because after queen c3 check, these are typical little traps. The only way to save your rook is to block with bishop to d2, but if you block with bishop to d2, you lose this knight. So that's something that you definitely have to watch out for if you're on the white side. So white usually just defends the pawn on c2 and is patient in recapturing this pawn on d4, figuring that black really can't save it. Sooner or later it's going to come under fire. And black doesn't even attempt to save it. He just goes knight to e7 here, white castles. And now, sometimes they play knight to c6, but I'm not super convinced by this move because white has this move b5. So I think the best move is probably to go a6 first, allow white to take, and then play knight c6. And I'll end the analysis here. At first sight, the position looks a lot better for white because he has more space and he has the bishop pair. And I would say that that's partly true. I do think that white is better, just not a lot better. I think white here can continue with some move like, say, bishop e3. And you might get a position like this. But yeah, it's a little bit better for white. But the bishop pair, for example, is not really such a big deal because bishop b5 options exist. So it's really more down to the space advantage and the argument that this bishop here is better than this knight. But even that argument is not so clear because this knight at some point will have some decent squares. Which side would I take? The white side, but at the club level and at even, you know, at the master level, absolutely anything can happen here. It's a small edge, but it's nothing crazy. So this all arose from this move bishop to a5 and b4 and c takes d4 and the main line with knight b5. But the absolute main line is the capture here on c3 instead. Now white recaptures, and this position has been reached thousands of times at the absolute highest levels. Black continues with his development with knight e7. Sometimes they can try other moves like queen c7 or queen a5, which are attempts to punish this structure, and white should know how to handle this. Unfortunately, for the purposes of this video series, I can't cover every single line, so the focus will be on the main line here, knight e7. And here again, it's a fork in the road. White has a variety of options here. One idea that is quite interesting is the move a4. The point with this move is that as black often will set himself up with the move pawn to b6 in order to activate this bishop, white can anticipate this and be prepared to sort of hammer away at that structure in the future. On top of this, this diagonal can be very useful for white, placing the bishop on a3. And finally, as we saw in the Winawer, sometimes black likes to place a bishop on a4. So this a4 move already scuppers that idea. Other funky moves are h4. It might seem very beginner-like to play like this, but the idea is very logical. Again, most of black's pawns are on light squares. This guy is the key guy. And so white actually wants to drive that pawn forward to h6 and induce some weaknesses on the dark squares. On top of this, because the structure is relatively closed here in the center, it's a locked structure in the center. Because of this, white leaving his king in the center is not such a big deal. It's not like if this was an open e-file. And so sometimes you might want to leave your king on e1 or f1, and then you have to activate the pieces. The knight can be easily activated, but what about this guy? So here's some rook h3 ideas can be coming into play. On top of this, you can also defend your queen side in this way. So this is really trying to squeeze the maximum efficiency out of your pieces. Nevertheless, the main line is queen to g4, and this asks a big question of black. Does he defend the pawn or does he not? If he defends it, he'll do so by castling, while if he doesn't, he'll play the move queen c7, allowing the so-called poison pawn variation. White, I think, should run the gauntlet, so to speak, and capture on g7. And then after rook g8, queen takes h7, c takes d4, we have a situation where for now black is down a pawn, but on the other hand, he has a nasty threat of taking on e5, on c3, and maybe also taking on e5 with check. White has a good solution to this. He goes knight to e2, and so if queen takes e5, now there's c takes d4, while if d takes c3, he will, for starters, defend this pawn and count on the possibility of bagging this pawn later on. It's a little bit hard to defend it for black. The main line, in fact, continues with knight to c6, and white again plays f4, hanging on to this pawn. You might be asking yourself, why not c takes d4 here? It seems like this is a great way of defending e5 and scooping this pawn up, and now white is actually 2 pawns up. And white, in fact, here would just be straight up winning if not for the fact that black has to move knight takes d4. And after knight takes d4, the point is you cannot take back here because queen c3 check would cost you material. So it's lucky for black that he has that move. Otherwise, c takes d4 would just be crushing that's why white instead goes f4. And black here, the main line is bishop to d7, queen d3, and now of course the threat is to capture the pawn on d4, so he takes on c3, and now queen takes c3. After the moves knight f5, rook b1, and queenside castle, a position like this can be analyzed for a long time from here. In fact, theory still continues with moves like rook to g1 here and d4. But for our purposes, what I would say is that this position, even just here, is one where I think from a computer perspective, white is significantly better. I think if you paired two supercomputers up against each other over a match of 1,000 games, I think really white would crush black. But at the human level, this is not that relevant because playability of a position becomes much more significant. And although white is up a pawn, his playability of his position, I think, is lower than the playability of black's position. Black's king is quite safe here on c8, whereas white has to figure out what exactly he's going to do with his own king. On top of this, white's material advantage in terms of that extra pawn is most noticeable here on the king side. But it's not straightforward to see how you're going to advance these pawns because black has some nice pressure along these two semi-open files. Black has a nice central pawn, and the structure on the queen side is very shattered. That means that down the line there may be squares like the c4 square that is very nice. On top of this, you still have a lot of your pieces in their starting squares, whereas black has no pieces in his starting squares. So, as I say, I think objectively speaking, what a supercomputer will do is they'll neutralize all the little black threats. They won't find themselves annoyed or frustrated by the practical difficulties of the position, and then they'll just convert their extra material. But at the human level, that's not how things work. So this is a playable position for both sides, and it's really up to you whether you prefer to play a position that's easier to handle, but you're down material and objectively probably worse, or whether you prefer to, play objectively a better position but more difficult to handle. That's a personal choice, but this is all after this move, queen to c7, the so-called poison pawn variation. A lot of theory there. Nevertheless, the main line is kingside castle, and here white plays the move bishop to d3. Now, again, another fork in the road. A lot of players, including world champion Magnus Carlsen, has played this move f5. It seems like a very logical move because you have this bishop and this queen. White is really preparing to attack, bring in more forces, and f5 just says, I will shut down these diagonals and I will challenge the queen. But after e takes f6, rook takes f6, bishop g5, rook f7, queen h5, creating pressure here on h7, g6, and now just dropping the queen back. I'm not so convinced by this position because let's say after knight c6 and knight f3, white has the bishop pair. Black has been induced into placing his remaining dark square pawn on a light square. There's an outpost here on e5. White has easy play like castle, maybe place a rook on this semi-open file. And black, on the other hand, he has to be a lot more creative here. And what does he really have to show for it? I guess he has a better structure on the queen side, but for me that's not quite enough to compensate for all of the problems. And tournament practice shows that white is scoring pretty heavily here, and that doesn't surprise me because for me I feel like objectively white is a little bit better, and in practice white's play is just much more straightforward. So I wouldn't recommend that, but hey, what do I know? Magnus Carlsen played it, and of course he didn't lose. He drew with this line against Karyakin in 2012. Nevertheless, the main line I think convinces me more, knight b to c6. And here a clever move from white to keep in mind is the move queen h5. The threat is not so subtle, it's checkmate on h7. And one thing that's nice to realize is that black actually cannot play either g6 or h6 in good circumstances. g6 would positionally be a disaster. White would gang up on those dark squares with moves like queen h6, bishop g5, maybe knight f3 to g5 as well, and the attack would be very straightforward. Whereas if h6, you can actually capture here on h6, And black took a few beatings in the 80s here from this position and didn't play it again. The point is, after takes, the threat is checkmate, and the line continues like this to capture, and now play queenside castle with threats to checkmate. It's a very primitive way of attacking, but it works. Maybe black, if he plays perfectly from here, can just about survive, but even that I don't think is possible. Certainly in practice, of the 5 games that I see in the database, white won 4 and drew 1, so not what you want to see if you're black here, and the computer really likes that that way of playing. So knight to g6 is the better move in my opinion, and the overwhelming main line is knight f3 here. Although I really liked a game played by Caruana against Sam Shankland with the move knight to h3 in the 2016 US Championships. The reason why I think knight h3 is something that should be investigated a little bit further is because let's first off show the actual way that the main line goes, which is knight f3, queen c7, and now bishop e3, defending this pawn on d4. Otherwise, black had some ideas like to take, and then if you take, then there's this, you know, queen c3 check kind of things going on. So bishop e3 just takes care of all of that business. And after c4, the threat here from white can be seen if black just wastes time with knight g5 here, striking against the pawn, and then if h6 you can take here on f7. The point is that when black recaptures, this knight will be lost. So of course you're down a pawn and you're being attacked to boot, so that's no bueno. So after bishop e3, black actually says, I really can't deal with all of these pieces around my kingside, so c4 here forces white to either make his bishop passive or to capture on g6. White captures on g6 here because of one thing in particular, one detail attracts him to this move, which is that black cannot actually capture h takes g6. The reason for this is that when white would move his queen back, eventually he would play knight g5, h4, h5, and black would be helpless against this kind of attack. So therefore black is forced to take f takes g6, and this leaves some weaknesses. But the logic behind this is that black can now drive his queen over to the king side, and from there the line continues knight g5. And here, worth noting, very important detail, is not this move queen f5 here, which is playable, but it's not very good after queen e2, defending the pawn on c2 and creating the threat of winning the queen with g4. So instead of this, black actually should put his queen on e8, and from there the pawn on e6 is defended. And also after white fires an attack, as again the theme continues to be the same, which is a kingside offensive for white. After this, black can play the move h6, and when white moves the knight back, then this pawn is already defended. Black here usually continues in a variety of ways, either b5 in order to use what black's asset is in the position, finally get around to attacking on the queen side, bishop d7, a preemptive developing move, or knight e7, which supports the g6 pawn, and in some variations may also land the knight to f5, or allow the queen to transfer over to the queen side once that g6 pawn is protected. So there's a variety of ways in which black can play, and honestly, if I was working with a 2200 rated student or something, we would almost start our theoretical analysis here rather than end it. But we could be talking for hours about this position, so we won't do this. I do just want to say one last thing, which is that the reason why I mentioned the move knight h3 instead of knight f3 as potentially a very attractive move is that this Caruana-Shankland game from the 2016 US Championships really left a big mark on me. It's just superb play by Caruana. I mean, the guy is just an absolute monster. He played the game continued with queen c7, again very typical fashion, bishop e3 defending the pawn, c4, and now takes, queen g4, and queen f7. So you can see that Sam Shankland actually played basically the exact same way as the main line goes with knight to f3. And the difference, however, is that if white now were to play knight g5, we would get exactly what we were just looking at after queen e8. However, because the knight was on h3 and not on f3, white had an extra option which he exercised, and that it was to move knight f4. And it turns out that the computers think that knight f4 is a little bit better of a move than knight g5. The knight is actually turns out to be more effective here. And also there's a plan of h4, h5, potentially striking at this pawn here quite quickly. So Caruana is just a genius to spot these very subtle little details. And the rest of the game was amazing play, and I think very illustrative of the different strategies of both sides. So we'll blitz through that game. Black went knight e7, white continued his attack, and now white dropped the queen back. It makes a lot of sense. White is preparing to play the move g4. That's what he does here. And black plays b5. So the reason I wanted to show this game, as I say, is because I think it illustrates the typical plans. White wants to play on the king side and black will play on the queen side. Now the computers at this point in time give the position as dead equal, but I think that they're wrong. At least this engine is maybe not strong enough to realize. I think white has, at least from a human perspective, much easier play. Here white went bishop to d2 and just waited for black to execute his queenside play with b4. And after capture, now he went rook to b1. White didn't allow himself to be distracted with c takes b4, which could lead to some tricky business after c3. You cannot take here because of queen takes f4. So he just went rook to b1. For now you cannot take because the rook would be hanging. The knight went to c6 and now queen e3, just supporting everything here on c3, d4 and f4. Black played b3, and it looks as though black is making a lot of progress, but after bishop to c1, well, it turns out that black cannot capture this pawn under good circumstances, since rook takes, knight takes, and now look at the full board vision of Caruana. Bishop to a3 would pick up this rook on f8. So very impressive line again. So instead, bishop went to d7. Now the threat of b takes c2 becomes a reality. Bishop a3 and b takes c2 anyway, since you cannot take this rook, since there's a threat here. The problem, however, is that after rook c1, rook c8, and rook takes c2, it was all sort of an optical illusion for Sam Shankland. It turns out that all of this counterplay, all of this pushing of the pawns on the queen side, was kind of just helping white, not helping black. I mean, if you look at it, white started with a structure where he had an isolated pawn here, and he had these two double pawns. And after black has invested so much time and energy pushing everything, all that he's gotten out of it is unisolating that pawn and undoubling the pawns here. And already the computers say that white is objectively winning here. White has a dominance on the king side, and now his heavy pieces are going to enter the fray on the queen side. Just for the sake of completeness, I will show you the full game. Rook a8, rook a2, bishop e8, and now the first piece goes to a beautiful anchor point there on d6. One set of rooks is exchanged, and now white transfers his queen over to the queen side. Strikes at g6, so black must deal with that, and now invades onto the 7th rank. The rook then invades onto the 6th rank, and after king g8, you can see I've drawn that the only two pieces that can really be heavily improved is maybe the king on g3 can find some safety elsewhere. We'll see, we'll understand why in a second. And this knight on f4 can be maybe transferred over to the queen side just to really break down black's attempt at some kind of fortress. So bishop c7 here, knight e7, a little bit of shuffling around follows, and now g5, and you understand hopefully now why the king on g3 is actually maybe not perfect. In some lines there can be some checks here. So we can see that Caruana first improves the placement of his knight, transfers it over to the queen side, and then before invading he plays the move king to f2, which is actually really a smart move. It's the best move in the position. If you played knight b5, there would actually be some tactical tricks like knight e7. The point is, if you take with the queen, you lose this knight, and if you take with the bishop, then rook b8 would pick up the knight. So very interesting lines. But they won't work if black doesn't, in some variations, have the move knight f5 check. So Caruana tactically is astute. He plays king f2. Black is just sitting around and waiting, as you can see, just shuffling back and forth. Black is totally resigned to passivity. And now when Caruana is happy that his king on c1 is about as good of a home for it as he can find, now he invades with the knight. The threat is knight to c7. This would disconnect the rook from the defense of the knight, and on the next move, the knight would fall. So black tried this knight e7 trick, hoping that if queen takes, then queen takes b5, and if bishop takes, then rook b8, and in both cases he would stay in the game. But Caruana didn't take the bait, and he played knight a7. And now you see the difference between the king being on c1 and the king being on g3, which is that if the king was on g3, knight f5 check would allow black to deal with this double attack by using that tempo gain from the check. But with the king on c1, that's not an option. And one thing that doesn't have anything to do with the French defense, but that I think is a really instructive thing to be aware of, concept to be aware of, is that when your opponent is very passive, you can take your sweet time building up your position. There's one thing that grandmasters love to do, and that is to just slowly torture their opponents. They're very quick to recognize when the opponent has active counter chances and when he doesn't. So this was a very illustrative game. Obviously, it's not a fair representation of the merits of the French defense to put, arguably one of the best players in the world at maybe even the best player in the world at 1e4 in 1e4 positions. The guy is just an absolute monster with 1e4, and his results against almost every opening, including the French, are incredible. So not a fair representation, but I do think it's been I do hope it's been an interesting game for you guys to see, because of the sort of the illustration of black attempting a queenside fight and a white attempting a kingside fight. And in this case, white won because he just he extinguished all counterplay on the queenside, and then of course the rest of the game played itself out. So that's it for the this video on the Winawer. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's certainly been quite interesting to research and to make. And if you have enjoyed it, then I hope that you will stick around with the French series. The next video will be on the classical variation. So hope to see you there.